Hello, everyone. My name is Jordan. All right, so before I want to begin, I just want to acknowledge I'm on the unceded territory of the Ganikahaga, Chipchoge, historical meeting place for many diverse indigenous groups. I just want to acknowledge and thank them for that, and that I acknowledge Catherine Richardson for providing a lot of research for this project. Yeah, so our discussion is going to be on the power of language within colonial agendas. And yeah, so it focuses also on the experiences of Louis Riel, which is in relation to the contemporary issues that are surrounding with Bill 96. And we will also be using the Cultural and Language Center's case study that opposes this legal framework throughout Quebec. Yeah, so we will begin with a few words from Louis Riel. I am glad that the Crown have proved that I am the leader of the half-breeds in Northwest, perhaps one of the acknowledged and leader of half-breeds. I am the opportunity of being acknowledged as one leader in this great country. I think that's important to understand this quote as it sets the stage for our journey and to seeing how these colonial powers have historically used language as not just as a tool for communication, but for imposing control and reshaping identities whole well round. Yeah, it's also important to note that Indigenous people since the 2021 consensus make up 5% of the total population. So yeah, here is the presentation overview. We're going to be looking at Indigenous ways of knowing into the residential schools, Quebec language charter. We will be demonstrating on to inform the audience of educators, policymakers, and cultural scholars on this on our interconnected lens or areas of research on Canada's educational and linguistic and psychological cultural landscapes. Yeah, so it's to understand the relationship of history in relation to um, the linguistic, I guess, revival and challenges that francophones have when they want to impose language laws like the Bill 96. And the thesis statement we're working with here is the interconnected struggles against colonial forces within Canada embodies by Lee Riel's uprising, the trauma of residential schools, and the linguistic contours of Bill 96 unveil a complex pattern, but a pattern of historical and ongoing resistance against colonialism and ongoing colonization. Yeah. So these are my key terms: symbolic languages. The language is a system of symbols embodying collective identity and the cultural norms, which is usually a universe of symbols, which would be predominantly English in Canada, and its opposition would be Quebec. It's pre-symbolic is a bit tricky because it's cultural expressions and understandings formed before the imposition of external structures such as language policies. So before things even existed, like the Constitution, or before the rise of Upper and Lower Canada into from British subjects to actual citizens. And the Indian Act, I think, is also important to go over because it's a federal law that greatly affects the cultural and linguistic heritage of Indigenous peoples and carries a lot of our rights, especially when it comes to the allocation and dispossession of Indigenous peoples onto reserves. And decolonization, just the undoing colonial legacies to affirm Indigenous sovereignty and education and language rights. And then Bill 101 establishes French as Quebec's primary language for official use. Residential schools were designed to assimilate Indigenous children, profoundly affecting their language laws. So Bill 96, which just enhances French language use, reinforces Bill 101's legacy. That charter with its amendments, it's a nasty one. And then Bill 101 in relation to its dominance mandates secularism, which is this push towards less religious symbols and public servants from displaying religious acts, I guess, of also worship. Louis Riel's day, which is also important to recognize, as it celebrates the legacy of Louis Riel as the leader of the Métis in his defense against the colonial state. Reflective question is, in what ways does Quebec's language laws intersect with the values and struggles embodied by Louis Riel? Okay, so here we have a discussion that covers, I guess, the complex events surrounding the Red River Rebellion and the execution of Thomas Scott, which was in itself a group belonging to the Orangemen, which was not want to say agents of colonialism, but more of a result of colonialism. And yeah, it just it dwells into the history of Louis Riel, and it's him being a prominent, I guess, Canadian figure for the acquisition period of Rupert's Land from the Hudson Bay Company. And it was during this time where Upper Canada and Lower Canada were going at it, and it really is the time of, I consider to be a lack of consultation with local Indigenous groups, and I guess even local populations, if you think about it. And it led to disaffection, which also led to a resistance on both occasions. Broader struggles were for economics, language, culture, so even from a socioeconomic standpoint, I guess. Even legal rights within Canadian federalism, as it touches upon, I guess, even constitutionalism between provinces and as a country overall to become Canada. And yeah, so it's just this idea and these optics around Riel's and French influence and English influence. Both sides portray him as differently. As one as the French see him as a martyr, and the English see him as a traitor. I guess these shifts between dialogue really consider how the disregard or sidelining of Indigenous voices does happen, and in times of retrieving pleasures, which would be like resources, land, and stuff and whatnot, and policies, and creating things on as tangible as laws in order to push language as especially particularly in Quebec, as we see today, like Bill 101. Indigenous peoples, the Kanien'kehá:ka did not have it, and it plays a vital role, these legal frameworks, and how the people, especially Indigenous people, react culturally, right? Because it's their identity being dominated. And it acknowledges, I guess, as language is a role in conquest, and its governments emphasizing, I guess, the importance of maintaining respectful relationships across diverse communities. Here it's a quote I got personal communication from a friend, well, a student of mine, a friend of mine. It's undergraduate student history. Department reflects on Louis Riel's execution, describes the following: him demonstrating his legal use of language as a tool of expression. And he talks about the time where he was processed, and due process was in English, and language he didn't fully understand. And it was just during this time, Thomas Scott, an Orangeman, echoes the current debates over colonial discourses like language policies in Quebec, where the French language charter acts as a tool of suppression of colonial conquest, straigning federalism through constitutionalism, which I think is important. How I think does Riel's fight for Métis culture mirror the same current debates that we're having in Quebec, which completely disregards the 11 Indigenous groups that we have here in Quebec, the government. Okay, so the devastating legacy of residential schools, I think, is also important to look at, because the Indian Act of 1876 was disgusting. It was a disgusting law implemented residential schools, mandating the assimilation of Indigenous children, isolating often away from the reservation, and putting them through horrible abuse and harm and just humiliation. It was during this time that I found out in my research that language in these schools is used to suppress and control the universe of symbols, which symbolically, before the Indigenous child or student was imposed in these systems and these institutions, before they were forcefully institutionalized, they were pre-symbolically seen as something that was objectively super filthy and needed to be dominated in order to have their resources. And that's what these schools did. They enforced English, they erased native languages and culture and destroyed their cultures. I think that, at times of during that time was tough. It was really bad. Government, Roman Catholicism, the Jesuits were enforcing a lot of different communities, especially like the Mohawk and the Haudenosaunee, to move up more north, establishing all these different reservations. The first one was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, in the United States. Yeah, it's just really nasty history. And I think, residential schools, and there's a settlement that happened, and it's not going to even come close to the justice that needs to be served for these survivors, and also the Truth and Reconciliation report that was done. It coined the word genocide for what happened during this time. Okay, so Quebec's linguistic legislation in Bill 96, I think it's important to understand Quebec's language charter, Bill 101 to Bill 96, in order to understand the framework of language from its measures to association and linguistic federalism. And it's just these clauses we have within our own constitutions, our own legal framework of conventions that enforce this bylaw, or this what we have for to enforce language policy, which is, I think, is very wrong. Bill 90, notwithstanding clause, I think it's ridiculous. And times did have change, evolving from assimilative approaches to more inclusive practices. But the fact that we have to use that word inclusive, I think it shows that what kind of house we're in. And given the population of the Indigenous people, I think it just goes to show how much damage we've done. A notable example of this opposition is the Ganawagis Cultural Center, which responded to Bill 101 in the 70s. The government of Quebec gave them application forms that they would give to immigrants in order to not do French. So the Ganawagi established many different institutions and schools, starting out from Mohawk mothers teaching their language in houses. And now it's completely expanded, and the learning off is seasonal, and it's great. And I think that it's, even though the micro land-based program, Donna Goodleaf is being executive director at the Cultural Center and being in charge of curriculum and pedagogy here at Concordia, I think it's very important. Quebec's language charters, Bill 101 to Bill 96, jurisprudence of language laws from protective measures, right to associations of linguistic federalism. That's not what scholars constitute to inform this language policy. I think that is very wrong, and I think the Cultural Center's success in creating and campaigning different institutions within their community and outside the community is wonderful, because even Quebec government supports them, giving them up to, I think, almost close to 15 million or something like that. It's a $16 million economic development. And I think it's important to know that this development is going to be phenomenal for the community. And so it's constitutional dynamics, which whole constitutions hold a lot of our rights, especially our land rights, for Indigenous peoples. And Quebec's use of the notwithstanding clause on multiple occasions in language charter raises concerns about the balance between provincial powers and federal obligations to Indigenous peoples, highlighting the historical and ongoing constitutional challenges facing amending the language within these documents, which often sideline Indigenous voices. Okay, so interconnectedness, resilience, and tenacious Indigenous spirit. It's in this context, I guess, of renewed Indigenous struggles in Canada that we often see this connectedness of just contesting a lot what's going on with the government, the ecosystems, the economy, how they react with the planet, in terms of colonial extraction, what they did to even Indigenous children in schools. I find is an attack on the Indigenous body, and missing Indigenous women and girls, attack on the Indigenous maternal body. I think it's nasty business, and it's out of pleasure, out of resources, out of even shame, I think, even guilt. And I think the the cultural center and the Ganikahaga Cultural Center, I think, with them pushing forward with the mandate. Well, not the mandate. I don't think we have a mandate, but it's working in line with the Great Law of Peace. I think it stands as a testament for resilience of the Ganikahaga people, and it embodies, this past, present, and future spirit that we often see and that oppose the Bill 101 and these nasty French language laws that show the prominence and potential for indigenous economic development. And yeah, language is a decolonizing driving tool. I think is also important. This initiative that they have is a decolonizing mechanism as a backdrop of Quebec's language charter and its evolution. And it's through this indigenous knowledges and pedagogies within mainstream society that we see, like with the micro line-based program of Concordia, shows the resurgence of indigenous knowledges and voices. And that's the reason why I chose to go in the First People Studies program in the first place, given my mom being a 60 scoop survivor and me being a Millennium Scoop. I think education policy intersects a lot. I think a lot of things intersect a lot, just like how the indigenous Cattery School or the schools that they have on their reservation, on their territory, on their land. It's very much learning off the season when it comes to food sovereignty. And it's the class that often puts their mind together and hearts to find what a project is meaningful to them. So yeah, I think it's a great example to look at historically, the call for action for decolonization. Okay, so yeah, cultural heritage, combining cultural heritage and curricula, I think ensures the continuation of variety of indigenous language, arts, and voices. I think that also elders as knowledge keepers play a critical role in education and helping see these programs change the very language within our own legislation, like the micro land-based program. And yeah, I think that you upholding, and naming for what they're doing is ensuring that the past remains significant in how to bring truth to reconcile those values that we cherish as Canadians, in order to bring justice and historical injustice that were often, legalized, and they were often legal at that time. And I think affirming sovereignty through advocating for these recognition for enforcement of indigenous economies and economic developments, it brings forth indigenous language rights, even as an act of sovereignty and support and localize international indigenous economies. So, even just like attending local events like a powwow or a social march, it provides a lot. Even working at these events, it goes towards the developments, which in Quebec there isn't much. They don't even acknowledge the Métis as an indigenous group, which is not surprising, given the fact they don't even acknowledge the full amount of indigenous groups that they have. So current initiatives is highlighting this decolonization efforts and their impact on indigenous communities. So like the cultural center and how they're impacting many different campaigns, partnerships, and relationship building. Another question is, how can Quebec language laws evolve to support indigenous language and contributes to decolonization processes? Which Quebec would often try to nationalize this figure of Louis Riel without even acknowledging through his work that federalism constitutes for very much of what our laws and privileges are based off of, which is language, trans-systemic, I guess, ways of seeing how culture, language, and even history matters to a country. So, conclusion and future directions, indigenous pedagogies. I think that highlighting the importance of combining diverse educational methods for honoring indigenous viewpoints, especially in education. I think that education is the forefront for really developing this trans-cultural system of embracing, I guess the historical injustices of indigenous peoples. And I think that, internationally, we already have this legal framework that's happening. And even Louis Riel himself was pretty known globally for his work. And I think that, a unified action is a way of bringing need for a partnership between indigenous and conventional education for more of a compassion. And I hate to say this, inclusive learning environment. I think pathways to indigenous wisdom and spirituality/intelligence is important. So I think in exploring future research like Buccaneers nationalism as described by Diderot in relation to the Quebecois colonial mindset to understand its influence on modern cultural and political narratives, and the colonial narrative overall it's important. Yeah. So, and also it's the Eye of the Master, I believe, or Leanne Simpson's insights on indigenous governments and education's impact on community building and sharing knowledges, or the work of property as a sharing or reflection of the nature of land ownership among the Cree and after the Pays du Brève by Melanie Chapier and published in 2018. It's critical for understanding the contemporary role of Cree. Of the Cree tallymen and how that creates this, I guess, this dual stewardship of traditional land within the context of modern economic development. I think it's interesting for seeing how that will turn out and pan out, including the Jojagis Ganawagi community. Yeah, so examine the Jojagis cultural and linguistic provision against the French language charter. Action for sovereignty and less performativity urges the adoption of policies that uphold indigenous linguistic and cultural rights. So really looking for what we can do for language as a whole when it comes to the Constitution. How can language for French language charter be reconciled with the preservation of Métis heritage and language in the spirit of decolonization in Quebec specifically? I would love to see and hear what you guys think about that, and perhaps leave comments. If you guys please can leave comments on the YouTube video, it'd be greatly appreciated. So yeah, here's my closing. My people will sleep for 100 years, but then when they awake, it will be the artists who give them their spirit back. Louis Riel, Métis leader. This is the assault, not just indigenous bodies, but on all citizens. Yeah. So I hope you enjoyed my presentation. I think that's important to know your rights, and indigenous people have been leading the way on these forefronts for a very, very long time. And I think it's important to recognize them for their strife and their efforts. Thank you. Wallahi.